You're listening to Parasearch Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or their affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Good evening and welcome to the Paranormal Concept Show. My name is Kerry Greenaway and my lovely Paul, as you all know, is actually at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre tonight, as we've just done a show over there. But tonight I am holding fort in the Paranormal Concept Studio and I've dragged my friend and authority of many topics into the studio with me, Mr. Andy Mercer. Good evening, Andy. How are you?
Hello. It's such a long time since we spoke last. It's got to be, at least about 70 hours.
I know.
You're back on again, you.
I know. I'm nagging you continually at the moment to do shows with me. What is that all about? Now, I love doing this. I love bringing you on to talk about a topic that I'm not too well researched on, and I hold my hands up. I'm not ashamed to admit that. And find out the truth behind it, because you hear so many myths and, folklore about certain things. And tonight's topic is no different. Now, from about 1981, I believe, a link between Nazis and occultism really hit our media screens with Raiders of the Lost Ark. And people made huge jumps of assumption off of the back of that, going forward with so many other films, podcasts, books, all about Nazis and occultism. I've heard some wild stories regarding the Nazis' involvement with occultism. So I wanted to literally find out the truth of the matter on this. So let's ask the basic overall question to start with. Did the Nazis run the war off of occult workings?
No.
No.
God, good show. I'll see you next week. Off now.
I was kind of hoping we would, find out that they'd found, the Ark of the Covenant and all that sort of stuff. But there's no truth to these rumours at all, is there?
Absolutely not. I mean, just give you a little bit of background to the origins of these kind of mythical, nonsensical stories. I mean, you mentioned Raiders of the Lost Ark, probably brought it very forward into people's thinking, but the idea had been around really since the 60s that there was some kind of strange link. There were a couple of books that came out. One came out late 60s, I think it was, Morning of the Magicians, which kind of intimated and then kind of stated very blatantly that there were black magic rituals being carried out at various places and these people highfalutin. And more popular than that was Hugh Trevor Ravencroft's The Spear of Destiny. That one sold huge. Again, it perpetuated various myths and ideas about Hitler's using magical occult powers, blah, blah, blah. But they were both far more fiction than fact, but they're presented as being fact. And I think you're looking at a time when, information that was probably lost, for a lot of people, the idea of what might be going on in those times. So they kind of made up stories to fill in the gaps. As time's gone on, we've learnt more about what was really going on under Nazi Germany and discovering the truth of these things. And there is a world of difference between the two, but yet the myth has sort of taken hold. It's almost as if they can become your archetypal boogeyman that, obviously very nasty people anyway, but they've taken on that mantle of being the always bad guy and given all these kind of strange extra powers. I mean, I say Raiders is only one example. There are all sorts of other sort of formats that have used them as being supernatural villains, things like giving comics and that kind of stuff, and other novels, which are still definitely novels, but people think, well, maybe there's some truth to that novel, that story. But it is really a myth that began to appear probably in the late 60s, early 70s. And then, of course, it's the other side of it is the kind of UFO community's belief of supernatural spaceships that the Nazis who have built and time travel, that kind of stuff. That also plays its part as well. So it all feeds into the mythology, of the nonsensical mythology about the supposed occult roots of Nazism.
There was a huge occult interest in Germany just after World War I, though, wasn't there?
Well, it's interesting because it goes back further than that, to be honest with you. It goes back into the very late 1800s. Excuse me a second. Where it really began as part of a kind of sort of pan-Germanic, trying to find culture links. You have to think back that Germany itself as a country, as we know it now, didn't really come into existence until the 1800s. It was actually a small collection of kingdoms loosely connected to each other that kind of worked together. But they became a united country in the late 1800s and wanted to try and build their own identity and find a sort of a meaning, if you like, a mythology to their identity as a single nation. And there had been a rise in interest across Europe more generally in sort of more spiritual matters in the 1800s, particularly with the rise of things like the Theosophical Society in the late 1800s, that the Theosophical Society embraced ideas first in kind of Egypt and India, that kind of further afield. And there was a kind of reaction to that idea and started to look for more of a domestic version, if you like, of sort of secret chiefs and mysterious hidden knowledge, looking for an alternative that was more European-based, didn't lean so far afield. And you had the rise of what became known as Ariosophy, this idea of old Arianism. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute because that's a term that's now very heavily loaded, of course, Arian, but it had a different meaning pre-World War I especially, and to some extent after World War I as well as before World War I. There was this idea of this sort of pan-European, Northern European mythology that you could find in the landscape around, and there was, you know, hidden cults that were operating, that had magical purposes, and all that kind of thing was part of the picture that was being painted by Ariosophy. This kind of hidden knowledge of regaining the ancient masters' wisdom, which is then ties into things like the runes, of course, and the Germanic myths and the sagas. Not just, obviously, we know the Norse myths with Thor and Odin and all that kind of stuff, but there's a Germanic version, like the Nibelungline, which is a Germanic myth as well, which is the basis of Wagner's Ring Cycle, and loosely connected to, of course, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It draws from that mythology. So there was that kind of movement of trying to find an identity and a mythology and a history, if you like, to the Germanic peoples. And that was fairly innocent, to be honest with you. I mean, there's always been, I say innocent is probably the wrong word, there's always been a little bit of kind of backdoor racism in Central Europe at that point, only in the sense of seeing themselves as being superior to everybody else, that sort of modern Europe was the pinnacle of economic and military and commercial success and wealth and power and all that kind of thing, lends itself quite well to the idea of being somehow superior to everybody else. So, I mean, today, us, it seems pretty unpalatable and unpleasant, but it wasn't that an unusual idea in those days to see yourself as being inherently superior because you'd had all this success with, you know, technology and the like. So the belief that they were somehow superior and of what you'd call the Aryan stock of a superior race. Now, the idea of a superior race is actually found in theosophy, the thing I was talking about to begin with, although that's not seen as anything racist. It was more forward, shall we say, more prevalent in sort of the Ariosophy approach. There was this idea of being this superior race of people, that we were somehow descended from that. Now, it sounds odd to say, I know, but in those days it was relatively innocent because the vast majority of people living in Europe, of course, were of European descent. So it wasn't like lots of strange other people around that they're going to start sort of trying to get rid of or sort of try and ban, that kind of thing you might get more recently. It was more kind of that sort of, there was a cultural identity of Europeans that saw themselves as superior and being basically more important than anybody else. And it was almost taken as read as if that was okay, that was how the world worked. I mean, over here we of course had the British Empire, and very much we saw ourselves as being superior to the Indians or people in Africa, the lands we conquered, saw them as savages and unruly. Although ironically, the ideas of the east of India particularly came over to the west from India via those routes. So there was a almost like a backdoor way of us embracing their culture by taking over parts of their culture, including the notion of Aryanism. Because historically speaking, the Aryan people are people of northern India, who then migrated west into places like what now modern Iran and Iraq, the Middle East. They didn't come as far west as we are, so that was a myth in itself. So those are the real Aryans, but the idea of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan is something that comes up later on. But I mean, it's a lot of talk here, but this is the real background to why these ideas are now sort of come to the surface. So you're looking at... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, no. That's the point, isn't it? You can't just sort of like jump into it. You have to look at the whole sociological, cultural influences leading up to the point of where Nazism started. So that is already
Absolutely.
within their culture and sociological upbringing. You know, the heritage, I think, is the word I'm searching for.
It's tacit. It's unconscious. It's not deliberately setting out to say that we are absolutely superior. It was almost like taking as read. Well, of course we are. You know, we've invented the wheel, we've invented this, we've built machines, we have factories, we have industry, we have machinery, we have all this. The rest of the world doesn't have it, so we must be superior. You can almost see how that mindset's going to work. But so it was almost taken as read, as I said, that was perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable to view the world in that way. But it starts to take a much more sinister turn, and inevitably it's opening itself up to that sinister return. Really, with the First World War. What happened in the First World War is a country like Germany, which at that point was actually ahead of us in terms of industry. Its GDP was greater than the UK, even though we had the massive empire at the time. But they were getting ahead of us, and I think part of the reason why we decided to go to war with them is because they were getting ahead of us. We can't have that, this new young country coming along and doing better than we're doing. That played into it, really. It was a kind of these superpowers in Europe that had might and strength and army and military wanted to prove themselves. They were waiting desperately for a reason to go to war. And, of course, things happening in Serbia with a prince being shot, and it all cascades into the First World War. Germany seems to be doing pretty well at first, so it's never managed to conquer France, but it still seems to be quite solid. Now, for the average German and the soldiers fighting, it seemed like all of a sudden in 1918, everything collapsed. The Germany was doing okay, it was fine, it was keeping its, it was still not forced back into Germany, it was still holding parts of France. All of a sudden it capitulated. Now what was happening really was, behind the scenes, Germany was basically putting everything it had into keeping its military going. It was bankrupt. The country was absolutely bankrupt. It could not keep going. But because it hadn't slowly capitulated down to a small territory like you get in the Second World War where everyone invades in, the people thought that, we've somehow been betrayed here. There's something going on. There's some dark influence that's controlling our country that's made it capitulate and collapse. When in actual fact, as I say, it was due to the fact that it literally ran out of resources. Germany as a country doesn't have many natural resources, not on the scale it needs to wage that kind of war. So it collapses. And it starts to make people wonder what's going on, what's really happening, who are our leaders and why have they failed us like this? There must be somebody to blame. And that's where it starts to get into the really nasty stuff. We are these superior people. We have this evidence we are superior, yet somehow we've completely capitulated and failed here. Somebody in the background is doing something that's stabbing us in the back. And that became a phrase that was quite popular at the time, the stab in the back. This belief that somehow the Germany had been betrayed by some inner workings or inner spy or inner force that wanted to see it fail as a country. When in actual fact there was nothing of the kind. As I say, it was an economic problem that they just couldn't sustain the war they were fighting. They had run out of resources. But you couple that with a kind of tacit racism that existed, or the belief that some of you have been failed, and you look for a scapegoat, you look for someone to blame. And you have systems of a mythology that's growing up around this idea of Aryan superiority, etc., that there must be someone who's trying to stop the Aryans be the master race of the world. This is very much fringe thinking at the time, but because of the economic collapse, and then, of course, you've got the actual recession, what's the worst thing? Depression that started in America, then spread across the world after that time. You had a country in absolute collapse. There must be somebody we can blame for this collapse, and there must be some force that we can rally around to give Germany back the strength it's been robbed by its competitors. So there's a background of this belief of superiority. There's a background of belief of, that the mythology can be reborn and made use of. And you have the rise of a number of right-wing organisations and parties, including one that eventually would come to power, of course. But they all recognised that you wanted to tap into this belief system, that there was this kind of betrayal that was going on, that we were mighty people who had been let down by inner forces, and that we have the natural rights to be the rulers of the world. And these are far-right groups played into those ideas. Now, if the German economy had been able to rebuild itself and been successful with the help of those that had defeated it, then the far-right would never have stood a chance of gaining power. But what happened was, instead, countries like France and the UK slapped on massive reparation payments. which meant they had to pay basically millions and millions of pounds in compensation for the damage they caused. And an already bankrupt country being forced to pay millions have no chance. So it collapses on itself. There's weak governments who have no real power. So people turn to something else to try and find that they can rise up and become one and prove that they're superior. So you've got this kind of attitude already existing, that they are a superior people that deserve to be ruling the world. Again, it's extremist ideas, but because there was a vacuum of power, they started to fill that space. So you have the rise of things like National Socialism, the Nazis as we know them, of course. And they want to tap into that belief of this ancient superiority. So they start to use those mythological imagery. You have sort of images of the Nazis riding on horses in suits of armour, waving the swastika as a flag above them. And they tap into that idea. And, of course, that itself lends itself into mythology and magic, of course. So the idea that somehow this is magically superior, that kind of works. But it was purely and only as a tool of rallying the people to them as a cause to believe in. The idea that they really were using magical power, it's one of those things that they wouldn't have denied it, because if it brings people to them, they say, oh, yeah, of course we are. But there's no evidence. I mean, people talk about people like Hitler himself being involved in occult rituals and stuff. I mean, he's nonsense. He never was. He never had any interest other than the political use it was. The only one who was a senior Nazi who had any real involvement or interest was Himmler. And he was, even by Nazi standards, a complete nutter in terms of what he actually believed in. He believed he was a reincarnation of a 10th century German king, or Germanic king, that he was recreated in the Knights Templar and his own version of it, that they were going to unite together under these banners and march to the east and take over as the Templars had supposedly done, which they hadn't even done. He was very much a believer that the runes had magical power that he could tap into. Now, it is true that the Germans did use some runic insignia in their uniforms. Primarily it was the SS, which of course came under Himmler, and that these runes were magically endowed. But the versions that they used were largely invented much more recently in terms of historically speaking. They weren't really using any proper historic set of runes, other than they used the Elder or Germanic Futhark, which is the name of a rune set, for some of the insignia. But some of the kind of deeper sort of magical imagery that they employed, this being the SS, including a thing called I forget the name of the thing. That was a ring called the Hottentot ring, which they got as a member of the SS. You'd be given this ring, and it contained the swastika, of course, the double X symbol of the SS, and 3 other what are called bind runes. But the bind runes themselves have been made from runes that were designed by a guy called Karl Maria Villigut. Now, he was like the esoteric rune master for Himmler. But he was actually a fraudster and a con man who'd previously spent time in prison for crimes and also spent time in a lunatic asylum. So he wasn't exactly the most, down-to-earth, trustworthy and normal person you could imagine. And yet for Himmler, he was like his secret magician. He had all this magical power. Villigut himself claimed to be descended from about 5,000 years' worth of runic magicians, and he could prove his history. It was all made-up nonsense, but unfortunately or otherwise, he was believed and was accepted as being true. And I'm going to pause and breathe for a moment, because I think I've talked a bit, and maybe have a question or 3.
Do you think? No, all I'm hearing at this point in time is a country basically on its knees, looking for people to blame, with a self-inflated sense of superiority in its own, in its own way, and lots of politics going on.
Yes, you've summarised in 5 seconds what I took 20 minutes to say.
That's what I'm hearing at this point in time. And I'm not really hearing any evidence, I suppose, of, apart from maybe a bit of symbology used, of any form of occult working. Now, talking about Himmler, he did have an SS department that was actually devoted to researching the alleged Aryan origins, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely, the Iron Herber. Yep. It ventured out to mainly Tibet in the search of proof that we were descended from the Tibetans. Again, it's a little interesting as why we choose Tibet. I mean, it's seen as one of the most ancient of cultures. I mean, mythologically speaking, they are the oldest culture. Mythologically speaking, not literally, because we can't prove it. But he wanted to prove that we are, because they would have seen us. The Nazis would have seen the Brits as being very much on their side and having the same beliefs. In fact, Hitler was very disappointed about the fact he had to go to war with us. He didn't want to fight us at all. But that belief that somehow we'd come from there through India to Western Europe was what they were trying to prove. And they would do it by measuring people's shapes and sizes of their skull, as if that somehow proved something about their ability and their size of their brain. Now, you can have a very large head and be as thick as two short planks, or you can have a small head and be very intelligent. There's no direct correlation between the two. But for them, of course, there was. They were trying to find and prove that origins of European people was over in the East in Tibet. They're also looking for things like mythical lands. There's Xinjiang, I think it was Xinjiang it's called. It's a very ancient Tibetan land that's supposed to be a magical land that's out there somewhere lost in the mountains. They were hunting for places like that. But when you go to things like looking for the Ark of the Covenant, that kind of thing, it just didn't happen. They weren't interested in finding that to that degree. They did have the Spear of Destiny, or at least one of the 3 or 4 that's supposed to be the Spear of Destiny, but the one they had was in a museum in Vienna anyway, so it wasn't exactly hard to find.
Yeah, it didn't there were no big quests to find it. It was there, it was accessible.
Exactly. It was there. I mean, that's what Hugh Trevor Ravencroft claimed about the Spear of Destiny in Vienna, was that Hitler saw that as a young man and had this strange magical vision with his friend and said, one day I shall rule the world, and his eyes turned funny colours and smoke came out his ears and that kind of stuff. No proof of that whatsoever. No evidence of that ever happened at all, but yet it was fully believed. I think, as I say, in that kind of post-World War II vacuum of what was really going on in Germany, a lot of people were able to invent rubbish because they didn't think anyone would find out the truth or not. But, that wasn't the case at all.
No, and I think if you look at any situation closely, you'll find links to, whatever you want to find links to, if you look hard enough. I mean, so we're not denying that Himmler himself did have a big fascination with his esoteric matters, like you've just said yourself, he had this, and pre-war he was sort of utilising that for folklore research to do with the Aryan origins, to do with the German people. But as soon as the war hit, that research, that side of things changed, because it then went into military matters and medical experiments and stuff like that. So that department's focus changed once they were in World War II, didn't it? It came away from the esoterics.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, there was still definitely, Himmler had his interest, there's no doubt about it. That remained the case throughout the period. But no, the RNA itself, it became a lot smaller operation because it was obviously not worth funding when they were trying to fight a war. They still continued to operate, and funny enough, one of its leading directors not only came out as gay, whether they knew he was gay, committed suicide and backed away from all of it and killed himself. But it's interesting the kind of things the RNA used to get up to. There was an interesting report from a local villager who actually witnessed all of this because they did the work. They said basically what happened one evening was a group of German officers turned up in the village in Germany, basically told them to go out and erect a stone circle in the middle of the woods at the night, erect that stone circle. A few days later, the RNA would turn up and claim to have discovered a hitherto unknown stone circle in the forest in Germany. It was like news across Germany. They discovered this. RNA had discovered this site that no one had noticed before. That was ancient, and they were like, "Well, no, we made it. You told us to make it." But they were shocked, so they didn't get to tell anybody. But the information came out, so they would go along and create stuff, they would find stuff, and they would make stuff, and then they'd bury it and claim they'd found it to prove their theories.
One thing I will say about German, at this time, at this particular point of history we're discussing, they were very, very efficient at propaganda. That's one of the reasons why some of the atrocities happened and were able to happen, because of the propaganda that they released. And they were very good at building a story to keep the belief in their reasons for war going.
Oh, absolutely. They were the absolute masters of propaganda. The idea of basically lying to your own people about what was going on was actually surprisingly relatively new in those days. the wholesale lying and deliberate deception of your own people for your own purposes. They were the inventors of that, to be perfectly honest with you. They knew full well what they were saying was outright outrageous nonsense, but it got them into power. And, it's a model, I'm afraid, that some governments still use. And say, no more than that.
No, we're not going to go into modern politics. We're sticking quite clearly in the Nazi and the occult links.
That played into that belief system that was kind of already emerging. They made use of it. But, there were real esoteric organisations operating in Germany in the 1930s that were absolutely active magically, but they were allowed to continue, and obviously until the Hitler came into power. They were even though the people who were members of the Nazi Party were associated with those organisations, they were all shut down as soon as the Nazis came to power because they had power now, so they didn't need them anymore. So that shows they were just being manipulated and used by these forces. I mean, there are some that did continue to operate. One particular one was the Tula Society, which did have the high-ranking Nazi Party members as members of it, not the leadership, as some books have claimed. Hitler, etc., weren't members of the Thor Society, but that one was allowed to continue to operate because it had very close ties to the Nazi Party. But many other organisations, including the one I am most interested in, the Armenenschaft, or the Armenenorden, was closed down and its leaders were imprisoned or killed. Because that's my area of interest, as you know, is a particular set of runes that were claimed to be used by the Nazis but never were. But most organisations, once the Nazis were in power, were got rid of pretty quickly because, as I say, it was just a useful tool of influence to people to support them. It wasn't a genuine, real interest in anything esoteric. So the fact that it was only ever used for political reasons meant there was no way on earth they were actually making use of ritual magic of any kind. I mean, there was a little bit. I mean, Hitler was interested in his own horoscope. In the case, you would consult a horoscope, and sometimes for the dates of planned battles might be a little bit involved. And there's occasions when there's a book whose title I forget now that was written by the guy who did actually carry out horoscopes for Hitler, and he was once occasionally told to rewrite the horoscope so it fitted what Hitler wanted. So you see, there's that game playing going on again. It was, as I say, it was more where they could make use of it rather than it actually being something they were definitely involved in. As I say, Himmler was the only one who had any real interest, and again, it was more to recreate his ideas of this sort of the kind of Prussian Templar Knights charging forward into the east to take control. It wasn't. There's no real evidence of any kind of lineage of rituals taking place. I mean, there are stories that you can't necessarily prove one way or the other. I know there was an occasion that soon after Wawelsburg, which is the castle that was the head of the SS was based in there, that there were bodies of Tibetan, possibly Tibetan monks were found in the cellar who'd either been shot or committed suicide. They don't know which, and you do wonder what on earth were they actually doing there. But again, it could be just brought over because of this whole Aryan idea of exploring Tibet. So they may have been there for that reason. Again, there are sort of symbols to be found within Wawelsburg, particularly, especially the most well-known ones called the Black Sun, which was carved, which is placed on the floor of one of their main meeting rooms, which is a symbol you often see around, which is an ancient symbol, but often what you see people use is the Nazi version without realising it's the Nazi version of the Black Sun, but it's an old symbol. That one occurs occasionally, but there's no evidence of real kind of rituals being carried out or anything along those lines. A belief in the possibility, yes, but that's all part of the mythology, the symbolism that were used. There's no concrete proof that they were using any magic to try and achieve anything, really.
Right. One thing I'd like you to explain to me, which is something that's confused me for years. Aryan race, blue eyes, blonde hair.
Yes.
But 99% of the Nazi Party weren't. So I can't... that part of my brain can't understand that concept. That if you don't, but if you're not that way, you don't look that way yourself, then how could you believe you're believing that something else is a superior race, not yourself, because you're not fitting that remit?
Exactly. Look at Hitler, 5'7", jet black hair. Goebbels had a club foot. He suffered from polio as a child. He was 5'4". Goering, about 6 foot tall, about 20 stone, drug addict. they're not exactly meeting their own supposed standards, which is the hilarious thing, of course. But no, it's an idealised, mythological, nonsensical. I mean, I say that even the term Aryan doesn't actually work. It's a borrowed term from another part of the world, and you can dig deep and hard and find why they put that particular term. And I say it comes back to Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, because they spoke of the Aryan race, but theirs again was more of a mythical idea, not the idea it actually really existed. Which, of course, is what the difference is there, that they believed it somehow existed. But yeah, I mean, it is nonsensical at best. Downright disgraceful what they do with it at worst, of course. I mean, there's obviously one element that we've not really talked about at all here, but there was the idea of, obviously, if we are the superior race, then no other races don't need to exist, and the one that stabbed us in the back, i.e. the Jews, need to be eradicated. That was obviously a very clear part of their thinking. And, it's often claimed, particularly in Germany, that people at the time didn't know what was going on. And you think, well, there are a lot of these camps around. These people were suddenly disappearing. It's a little difficult to believe no one knew what was going on. I mean, the average Joe public may not have known, but I think it was probably wider known than some would like us to believe now. But, again, it's one of those things I think...
Or was it an apathy towards it because of... Yeah. The hardships that, we've talked very much the political spectrum tonight but for the man on the street, the everyday person, hardship, someone to blame. Yes. It's basic, isn't it? What I say. And so there becomes an apathy, doesn't there, towards it. All of a sudden these people are being removed from society. You're blaming for your own personal hardships on a day-to-day basis. You don't care.
Yes, you're blaming some other force that's around you that somehow has stabbed you in the back. As I say, that comes back to that notion. That's why it's important, because that idea existed. It wasn't something the Nazis invented, it was there, but they made great use of it. I mean, one of the things you can talk about also is, I say that they didn't use rituals. Of course, in a sense, they did, because their mass rallies were rituals in themselves. Those huge gatherings, the so-called party rallies they'd have every year, when literally millions of Germans would be there, obviously in uniform by the point again, with the Nazis in power. There were massive rallies. They were kind of invoking Wotanic spirit, if you like, the old Wotan, as they call it, Odin, as we would call him, that kind of warrior spirit, trying to not intentionally, deliberately, purposefully summon it, but they were still trying to build on that whole notion of the one identity, the one people, one nation thing they were trying to promote. So that, in a sense, is kind of ritualistic. It's not a proper ritual of magic that you carry out in very specific ways that we've talked about before. But that kind of group psyche that you're working with, that group mind, how you can influence the people by telling them the things that they want to hear, whether they're true or not, isn't as important as them believing them to be true, which is something we talked about on many occasions. But it does get very sinister when you're proposing these kind of aberrant concepts and ideas that any particular race of people is responsible for your failings. Therefore, let's blame the foreigner in our midst, as they were described. They were the people that had no place in our society, that they're here and they're everywhere. So they played into that idea. They weren't the only party, as I say, to do that, but they were the most successful party to use that idea. And the more moderate people had no chance, because they were saying, if it's not them, why did we all fail? Why did Germany do so badly in the war? Well, it's for this reason. When you start laying out long, complicated economic reasons why the country failed, they don't want to hear that. They want the headline of, oh, no, it's his fault. So it played into that. So you've got that kind of... It's almost like a mass, I don't like the term mass hypnosis, but it's that kind of thing, this kind of mass hysteria, this belief system. And, one of the things that was asked of people after the war who'd been around as adults before Germany fell into Nazism, well, why did you believe these people? Well, they were promising us things, promising us economic recovery, roads, jobs. Yeah, we knew about this kind of hate the Jews stuff, but we kind of thought, well, we'll ignore that bit. They don't really mean that. Shit, they don't really mean it. My God, 6 million dead later. Yes, they did bloody mean it. Yeah. But that's the thing. It was that let's ignore or edit out the bit we don't particularly like the sound of. We'll just pretend that's not part of it. But
also you have to remember the restrictions that were placed on people. I mean, books were being burnt and all that sort of thing. Yeah. So, what you're being fed, It's a control, isn't it? It's all about control.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one thing with the Nazis. They controlled everything at every level. There's a mass book burnings of anything that didn't suit their light. Art was destroyed. Institutions were closed down. If you had any kind of position, perhaps as a lecturer at university or anything like that, you had to be a member of the Nazi Party. You had no choice. People criticised some sort of writers and philosophers of the 30s who weren't Nazi supporters who joined the party. But you had no choice. You either joined the party or you had not only no job, you had no home, no house, nothing. You didn't have a choice by the time they were in power. Of course, some people obviously did believe what they were spouting, but some people just had no choice but to go along with it because they were forced to, because they would lose their reputation and their livelihood. So they were controlling of every level of society. And again, it's not something you've really ever seen before. That's one of the reasons why I think, in a sense, they were so successful at first. I mean, you think about it, they conquered Europe, apart from us. That was pretty much it. There was one point in the Second World War where the Germans controlled the whole of Europe, North Africa. The only bit they didn't have was us and the countries like Switzerland, who were neutral. Because they'd whipped them up to such a further of belief that this was the right thing for the nation. They were going to become a strong, great nation. And whereas we'd kind of won the First World War, we were like war weary. The last thing we want to do is get involved in another war. So, of course, we sat back and let them take power and do what they did. I mean, it's often been said, one of the first things Hitler did, I mean, it's a bit of a sidetrack here, but just give him for a minute, was to cross the Ruhr Valley. Now, the Ruhr Valley is part of Germany, but the part to the west of the river, Ruhr, was demilitarised. They weren't allowed to put troops in there at all because it was bordering on France. The first thing he did to come into power was very gingerly, tenderly, on horseback, send a few soldiers across the Ruhr, expecting the French to say, no, we're not doing that, go back. And they didn't. And that opened the door to all the things that came later about taking power over the rest of Europe. It allowed them, we allowed them to take power because we didn't want to deal with another war. It's a whole idea of appeasement. But, you can understand that if they're successful, this is where I'm going with this, they're successful in challenging the authority around them, which crush them, there must be something special about them. There must be something magical about them. They must be tapping into some great dark power. That's how the myth begins. That's where that mythology starts to really form, that they are tapping into something incredible. And, it gets difficult now, modern times, to separate the fact from fiction. I mean, watching just recently, I don't know if you've ever seen a film called Hellboy.
No.
Well,
not my kind of film.
It starts off, Hellboy it's basically based on a comic with this guy who's supposed to be the director of the Thor Society I mentioned about as being some great dark magician. Now, I've read people who said, well, that's kind of based on fact that they did carry out these magic rituals. What? No, they didn't. Didn't have this strange technology and that kind of thing. And the leader of the Thor Society was not a leading member of the SS who was wearing kind of strange masks because he was 150 years old. It's like, no, that's just rubbish. But some people believe these things to be accurate. You think, oh my God.
I mean, again, what I'm hearing here is that at that time they were pushing boundaries, not just they were pushing boundaries, and we've seen that before with occultism, haven't we? Pushing boundaries, going beyond, learning more, higher knowledge, and pushing those boundaries. And they were doing it physically by, like you said, with the French border. They were doing it with technology. They were doing it medically. I mean, we actually, much as we deplore some of what they did, a lot of what came out of the experimentations that the Germans did at that time has actually pushed forward the medical field since those days. I'm not saying they did it. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it has done that. So Germany...
It's a difficult area, actually. Well, you've actually drawn into commenting on a very, very difficult area that has been discussed for many years. What was the validity of some of the discoveries, because of the source of the discoveries that were made for medical experimentation? Should we use them because of what we knew? And it's never been answered. It's not got an answer. Some people say we should never use this information because of the way it was drawn. Others say, well, these people died. At least we're making some use of their deaths by using what was discovered. So that's a very touchy area, actually, in the medical profession. I know, from what I've read, it's a difficult one. But I mean, the obvious example that's most important, if it hadn't been for the Second World War and the V2 rocket program, which was built slaves, we wouldn't have gone to the moon. I mean, okay, so obviously we haven't been to the moon at all, but we wouldn't have the spaceships we have now. We wouldn't be going into space because, of course, the V2 rocket design is the basis of the Apollo, or the Gemini, first of all, and then the Apollo moon missions. So, you can argue that would have probably taken a bit longer because of the technologically, they were, towards the end of the war, they were racing ahead of us. I mean, okay, we got the atomic bomb first, but in other non-nuclear areas, the technology was way beyond what we were capable of at the time. So that it was turning into a real arms race at the end. It's just the richer, the Germans, thankfully, run out of land and run out of resources again. But this time, I say they collapsed internally as well.
Yeah, but as I say, it's that pushing boundaries. They were prepared to go where we hadn't gone in lots of different areas. And it is no surprise that there is that mental gymnastic leap that they would have pushed the boundary in other ways as well, particularly with these rumours.
It's trying to explain these seeming successes, both, as I say, technologically as well as militarily, and land expansion. There must be something darker driving it. This whole idea that people put forward the notion that somehow the Hitler was the Antichrist. That's been floated on more than one occasion. That he was somehow. I mean, he himself believed he was sent by some divine power to Earth. Others might argue some more diabolical powers to Earth. These ideas are out there. And it's complete nonsense. It was just an ordinary, rather dangerously, very complex psychologically speaking, but as an ordinary human being who wasn't involved in ritual magic whatsoever. But the mythology, as I say, that's grown around it is partly because it wasn't really challenged because it was just all a bit of a mess after the war, but because it's kind of taken root in the minds of people into the group psyche that they were somehow tapping into something. It's stuck. And even though there are very good books that outline in great detail how the two are being interlinked, let's say propaganda has been turned into fact, where fiction has turned into fact, but propaganda has become reality, that's, it's all interwoven and it is separable. There are some brilliant books out there that do really take apart this nonsense and show the truth of the reality of what it is. But for every one book like that that's been published, there's 5 that talk nonsense. And of course, you're batting against all those books. That's the difficulty.
Exactly. And this is the problem. I mean, I've heard some very wild rumours regarding this, and this is the problem, isn't it? Where do you separate fact from rumour? Now,
Absolutely.
We do know that the Nazi Party were very, very good at destroying the evidence, of covering up and getting rid, particularly in the final days leading up to the end of the World War, when they realised they were going to lose. They were very, very good at covering their traces and destroying evidence of...
Well, that all began, really, when they failed to capture Stalingrad. That was the high command of Germany, sort of directly beneath Hitler. Hitler was the one who was ultimately in charge of all of it. But the senior leadership of the military, that separate the military from the political, the military themselves knew that not taking Stalingrad, as early as 1942, was enough that they were not going to win, because they knew they had to conquer Russia. If they didn't conquer Russia, eventually Russia would push back, because the Germans were after the oil. That's the one thing, as I said, they lacked the military. They had the military might and everything, but they lacked the resources, and they had no oil of their own. There's no oil naturally found in Germany. They had synthesized a form of oil which wasn't very good, but it was usable. But they were after the Caucasus, which is a part of southern Ukraine now. But it was it's in Russia. No, it's Ukraine. It is Ukraine. Sorry. Anyway, that area was what they were after. They knew they had to capture that. If they failed to capture that and didn't capture Moscow and defeat Russia, they were going to lose the war. They knew it. But you couldn't tell Hitler. Of course, you couldn't tell any of the political leadership. There was no way on earth they would ever accept that. So the idea of starting to cover their tracks began fairly early on, in the war, because once they realised they'd failed there, they knew they weren't going to win. So, yeah.
So do you think, then, there's any chance of any esoteric workings? Do you think that could have been destroyed, or it just didn't happen?
It just didn't happen. We know a lot of what did happen because of eyewitness testimony of people who were there at the time. They might have got rid of records, but the people who were basically fighting on their side, German soldiers, etc., and sort of lower-ranking military, recognised that strange things were going on, but they were witness to what was going on. It wasn't somehow kind of a hidden secret. You can burn the documents, you can blow up the concentration camps, for example, but people around know these things were there. You know, the things happened. I mean, some of the camps, as an example, completely disappeared. You know, they were just eradicated, but the people living nearby knew what was going on, witnessed what was going on. So they were able to speak and say, no, this is what's happening. So, you know, records can be destroyed and lost, memories remain, they survive, and people who were around survive. It's like this whole idea that kind of fits into this magical nonsense is the idea Hitler somehow survived in the Second World War. He was actually alive and escaped to South America. There was a TV show not so long ago that was a number of episodes that was talking about, was Hitler, could they find Hitler in South America? And well, lo and behold, found proof of the Nazis in South America. Whoop-de-doo, everyone knew that. There's no mystery there. But, you know, Hitler didn't go down. They didn't escape. You know, there are witnesses, eyewitnesses who were in the Führer bunker who actually heard the shots, saw the dead body, etc., etc. You know, they've got nothing to gain by claiming that, you know, they was shot and he wasn't. He was, absolutely. But funny enough, the person who first began the myth of Hitler surviving the Second World War was Stalin, because it was a great excuse to keep all the Russian or Soviet soldiers and troops in Eastern Europe, because there's a chance Hitler was still around, he might arise again and rally followers. So, of course, it was in their interest to keep the myth of him still being alive, because it was a good excuse for them to stay in Eastern Europe. So the originator of that myth is actually Stalin himself. You know, he's the arch enemy, if you like. But, you know, there are records exist, records have been found later on of things that we didn't even know about, that they were being recorded and kept, that survived even the most dramatic of devastation. In Dresden, of all places, a city that was almost annihilated by the Allies during the war, records were found recently, only about 10 years ago, of all things, shipping routes in the first 20 years of the 20th century, including the shipping routes that went across the Atlantic, across the North Atlantic, across the ice fields, where a certain ship sank in 1911. Actually showed records of what was going on in the sea around when the Titanic sank. And it showed that there was some very unusual, anomalous activity happening with layers of air causing different changes of temperature that created strange mirage effects. And it's been put forward as one of the reasons why the Titanic sunk was it didn't see the iceberg get hit because of the mirage effect of the hot and cold air. Now, those records were in Dresden. Of all places, they survived the Second World War. So, you know, records get found that have meaning and significance, even in places where you wouldn't think they were going to survive. So, yeah, things were being destroyed, no doubt about it. Records were being hidden and got rid of. Documents, obviously, about the Holocaust were trying to be burnt en masse, but things have survived. And, you know, the evidence that things did happen can be found. And you can't prove a negative. You can't prove absolutely these things didn't happen, but the evidence doesn't exist to suggest they did happen, is the best way I can put it.
Okay, dokes. Now, one of the key points, I think, of the link between the SS and occultism is actually something you've mentioned already. Now, I can't say this castle's name. It's Valsburg Castle.
Valsburg, yeah.
Right, okay. Yeah. Now, this is supposed to have been the site of all of the SS occult rituals, allegedly. Yeah. But again, like you say, there's no evidence of that whatsoever, is there? I mean, Himmler himself was very involved in that castle. He was going to do, he had extravagant plans for the castle, but they didn't really come to fruition, did they? Or did they?
No. Only partially. I mean, it was designated as an SS training facility during the war period, and it was kept secret that it was actually the headquarters of the SS. But it was those, again, obviously people have survived who actually worked there, who were involved in it. So they used to spend sort of hours kind of sitting, meditating and contemplating the meaning of life and the meaning of the Arianism. And it was generally considered rather boring. You just sort of sit around for hours thinking about this stuff. There was a kind of no more of a mystical ritual magic than you might see, like changing of the guard, you know, kind of walking around with your swords and sort of waving them around and things along those lines. It was that kind of ritual ceremony, not necessarily ceremonial magic of raising spirits. As I say, there was suggestions that these Tibetan monks were based in Valsburg. Again, Arnold Ibn had been to Tibet a number of occasions from the late, even before the Nazis came to power, there were visits there. So it's not entirely possible they brought some of these monks back with them. That's no problem at all. But what they were doing there, why they were there, is anyone's guess. I mean, it wouldn't fit any. I mean, we're talking about sort of Western style occult ritual magic they were supposedly using. That wouldn't involve Tibetan Buddhism or Tibetan monks. I mean, there are versions that involve sort of more kind of demonic powers, which I think we touched on briefly on Sunday, if you was in us on Sunday. But the idea of demonic power in sort of the Far East and Tibet, etc., is quite different to our Western idea. So it wouldn't fit. You know, the two don't fit together. But again, there's no like ritual room that's discovered with all sorts of other things. I mean, Wellsburg Castle survived intact. It wasn't damaged in any way, shape or form. It was abandoned, but it wasn't damaged or burnt down or destroyed. It was left as was. It literally ran off and hid, basically. It's really funny. And funny little side point, I just got to risk it. I don't know if he's still there, but a little while back I was just looking into information about the guy that runs the museum is actually English. It's a bit strange, but there you go.
We pop up everywhere, the old English, don't we?
First time was the first one who actually worked there or something. You know, we didn't like the idea of being involved in it. But yeah, it's still there as a museum. You know, you can still visit it.
Yeah, I mean, these places you can go and visit still. You know, there's a well-documented stuff goes on in those places. And like you say, they just kind of abandoned that castle. They didn't destroy in the same way they had destroyed records regarding crimes they'd done, like crimes against humanity. Yeah. There wasn't that scale with regards to their military.
Yeah, I mean, they'd be too busy trying to destroy evidence like that, you know, was going to show the world what disgusting creatures they actually were, the horrific things they were up to. They would want to get rid of those things. They're not going to worry about sort of strange ritual costumes they may have been hanging around in the wardrobe. You know, that wouldn't matter. It was what they've been doing to the people that was going to be discovered that they wanted to hide.
Because that's the bit they would have been held accountable for.
Well, absolutely. I mean, of course, the Nuremberg trials. I mean, the idea of putting a people, a nation on trial like that was new, but it was very necessary. It was the best way to deal with it. You know, even Churchill was not too sure we just ran them all up and shoot them all. But no, it was actually the Americans that said, no, let's put them on trial. Let's show that we're better than these people, that we are. We respect the rule of law regardless of what's happened. We're going to put you on trial. I mean, just foregone conclusion what they're going to find, of course. But they did have a trial where the truth was revealed to the world from their own lips. That was the key element. It was the leaders of the Nazi movement who'd survived were put on trial to say what they'd done and what they believed, and it was from them directly. You know, you have someone reading out saying this is what they did, blah, blah, blah. People can say, well, yeah, I made that up, or no, I don't believe that. But when you get the people who did it saying, we did this, then that's a different... you can't ignore that. And that's which was quite brilliant, really, I think. It was a good move.
So what happened? I mean, we spoke at the beginning of the show regarding the political and sociological impact of belief system, of how this happened, you know, how this situation happened. What did that do to the Germanic belief system after the war?
It destroyed it. Effectively destroyed it, because anything that even had a vaguest hint of that kind of pan-Europeanism, of sort of anything to do with vaguely associated with Nazism, was destroyed. It was literally like nothing to do with that at all, including, I say, the runes themselves, which have an ancient history of runes, but they were seen as, because they were tainted and used by the Nazis, that they were just unacceptable. It wasn't really until the 1950s that a couple of books popped up that began to resurrect them, really. I mean, as you probably know, of course, I'm writing the second edition of a book I wrote on runes that are based particularly on a set of runes that were used by these early organisations, not the Nazi stuff, but the kind of the Ariosophy organisations that had an interest in the Armand and runes. I'm writing about those. But all runes were seen as being, you know, can't touch those, don't go near those. That's changed, because, I mean, it's not the fault of the runes that the Nazis used them any more than, in a funny way, nor is the swastika, really. It's not the swastika's fault that the Nazis polluted it. And the interesting thing, as someone pointed out again recently, which is always worth knowing, the Nazis, the Germans, didn't call it a swastika. We called it the swastika. They got a different name for it, Hexenkreuz, which is the crooked cross. That's what it was called there. But we always translate it as a swastika, even though the actual proper swastika looks a little different. If you've ever seen the Indian one, it's horizontal and vertical, not diagonal, and points the other direction. That is the proper Hindu swastika, where the name comes from. It's not actually the correct name, but we all know it as such. That's probably a symbol that's never going to be resurrected or cleansed or freed of its history, unfortunately, at least not for a very long time.
No, and I was going to bring that up actually, because that symbol in itself, although was used by the Nazi Party and twisted into its own format, as it were, was an ancient symbol long before they took it on, and had power in its own right. But like you say, now that's got this tainted association to it. And I think you're right. I don't think it'll ever be viewed in the original way it was viewed.
Not in Europe, certainly. I mean, a further afield than the Hindus will say, well, it's always been our symbol, we're always going to use it. So absolutely. And you'll see it in Hindu temples in the UK, the swastika, the proper swastika is used. There's a bit of a trend now in Japan where they end text messages with a symbol whose name I've forgotten off the top of my head, but basically it's a swastika. But again, it's a horizontal, vertical version. And a lot of them, there's a little video on YouTube that's out that's worth looking at. There's a lot of younger Japanese people being interviewed who didn't realise what the symbol meant in Europe. When they've shown the swastika, the German version, they said, well, that's not really the same symbol, but it was who? What? They didn't even realise. And considering they were allies of Germany, of course, until the end of the war, it's quite surprising. And there was an older Japanese man speaking on the same video who said he was quite disappointed when he realised how little of that part of Japanese history is being taught, and he says it's very disappointing that that's the case. It's a difficult one, because how do you move on, but at the same time you can't forget? So you're almost in a bit of a limbo with things like the swastika. You're kind of caught in limbo between those two positions. You want to move on and be able to use what is a sacred symbol to many people around the world. I mean, there are examples of the swastika or that style of image all over the world. I mean, there's a very ancient example here in the UK, up in Ilkley Moor, that's been preserved and protected. It's found in, obviously, Scandinavia. Its symbol is found. It's found in Africa. There's even, believe it or not, a version of it appears in a Jewish manuscript, a Kabbalistic manuscript from the 1500s. There's a version of it in that. It turns up all over the world because it's one of those deep psych symbols that seems to resonate with people throughout the world. It's part of the reason why, of course, the Nazis used it. But they weren't the first. They weren't the first overtly racist organisation in Germany at the time to use a swastika. It was adopted by other organisations. Probably the best known was the I always got the name quite right. It's similar to another group, so the Order of the New Templars. Which formed in 1904 by Lance von Liebenfels. He was very much an Aryan superior believer, and they were the first German organisation to adopt it as their symbol, but it was slightly different. If I remember right, it was yellow on a red background or a blue background, might have been. But it was slightly different colouring, but it's the proto swastika, if you like, the proto-Nazi swastika, and that's probably where the idea came from, that it was, again, tapping into that idea. So as a symbol, that's the one that's obviously most closely associated with them. But thankfully, others, like the runes, have been resurrected and rescued from that sort of dustbin of history, if you like. Yeah,
definitely, most definitely. Now, do you think then that it's almost become? Do you think it's become an excuse? Well, they were under dark occult influences, and it gives people an understanding of how people could be so cruel to each other.
Yes, I mean, it's used as an excuse, almost like it's got to be some kind of supernatural power. People aren't that dumb en masse, are they? Are they? No, there's nothing worse than the group psyche when you really tap into something, when you present them with something that fits their belief system. As I say, that's why that long rounded bit at the beginning to get the real background, to make people really understand that they didn't just appear out of the blue. It wasn't some kind of mad 5 minutes in Germany that these extremist loonies came to power. There was a reason why they did. And it was also because they played into this idea, this belief that there was somehow magical powers out there that you could tap into to win the war and take over the world. They made use of that search for identity, that search of proof of superiority. They made use of it. So, of course, there was something pre-existing. So there was a propensity to believe that as a possible explanation, that because it was the easiest thing to grasp. I mean, there's this old saying about the simplest solution is probably the right one, but that's nonsense. Solutions can be incredibly complex and to be the right ones. But the idea that somehow somebody was trying to sort of defeat them from the inside, that we need to rally together to kick out the foreign enemy and sort of be the superior people we're destined to be. That was all part of that thinking. But that in itself is magical thinking. It's trying to believe you're something bigger than you actually are, trying to create an effect that's beyond you as an individual.
And do you think now, looking back at that time, people find it very convenient to use that as an excuse?
We are getting down a very dangerous road, because I would say that's exactly what happened a couple of years ago in our country, but that's a whole other story. The idea of putting forward beliefs about certain things, and when you actually drill down into what's supposed to be the case, you think actually it doesn't quite fit. But this headline suits our plans, and a certain particular political party in this country has made use of that to absolutely bring themselves to a point of almost dictatorship power, and we're seeing it right now happening, even with the court of law saying that the people being deported back to the Caribbean shouldn't be doing it because it's actually breaking the law. They've just done it anyway. You know, that's the kind of thing that happens when you start believing myth, when you start believing things that fit a belief system rather than the facts. But that's getting down a very dark road, so let's back out on that one.
Let's not go down that road. Let's not. As you can see, history is never black and white. It is a whole spectrum, and you need to view the whole build up to it, the whole sociological, cultural belief systems of a nation that were brought to their knees to try and understand it. And occultism got mixed in there, and a mythology has grown out from that based on very little fact, everybody. So again, do your research, do your digging, and be discerning in what you're reading. On that note, thank you once again, Andy, for joining me in the studio.
No problem. I loved it as always.
It's been absolutely fascinating, and I've learned a wealth of information tonight that I didn't know before, so thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget, everybody, you can listen to the rest of our shows 9 p.m. every single night on Parasearch Radio, and the Book of Parasearch is available to purchase worldwide on Amazon. Just go over there, search it out, and also available now at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. On that note, I bid you all a very farewell and a good night. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.